Hello, I'm Robert, fact-checking the stories that scare people. And this is this claim that Biden has just made that Putin has already decided to invade and attack Kyiv in a few days' time. And to start off with, there's no way that Biden can know such a thing. That by itself shows that he's bluffing. He can't know that. He does not know what is in Putin's mind. Only Putin knows that. I thought that President Zelensky put it rather, he has a rather gently poking fun at this claim. So the question said, what I want to ask you, Mr. President, is the US has their intelligence and you have your intelligence. What is your interpretation of Putin's intention? Not his capability, his intention. Do you think he will invade? He will decide to do that, or he has. And Zelensky just said, I don't know what the President of the Russian Federation wants. That's why I propose to meet. That's it. He said it rather humorous the way he turned the question around, and everyone started laughing. And but that's the situation. Now, some people worry that this means that Putin is that Biden is trying to start a war. I don't think that's it. No, that doesn't make sense. There's no way that this ends up with NATO fighting Russia, because Ukraine is not part of NATO, and Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons, and the United States has no commitment to defend Ukraine against Russia. It would only supply weapons, and defensive weapons, not offensive ones, not to attack Russia, but just to defend themselves. So I think it's hard to know why Biden said this. It could be a kind of a pre-bunk, so that he is saying this in order to try and to get Putin to keep saying he's not going to invade, in order to prevent even the slightest hint of any kind of attack on Ukraine. And then it could also be a prelude to tough negotiation, that he wants to get the best hand he can in negotiating with Putin. And so he's kind of putting him on his back feet like this. Anyway, Biden said that so both sides here can't be telling the truth. So Biden said correctly, so Putin, Russia, claimed that they have intelligence that Ukraine is going to do a massive attack on the Donbass region. And that, as Biden correctly said, that defies basic logic. For the Ukrainians to choose this moment, with well over 150,000 troops on its borders, to escalate a year-long conflict, that makes no sense. But then it also defies basic logic for Putin to wait for a year, go away, come back, and wait for many more weeks, wait for Ukraine to get tougher and get stronger and stronger and stronger, and then say, right, and now NATO is all prepared, and everyone is ready for us to come. Now is the time to attack Kyiv. And it also defies basic logic to attack Kyiv at all. I mean, what could Putin's plan possibly be? I mean, in principle, they could capture the Ukrainian parliament building. It is possible to capture that building. Now, it wouldn't be as easy as Biden makes it out to be. He couldn't just march over there in a few days, as we will see. And that's most of what I'm going to be talking about. But after weeks of fighting, and with hundreds of Russian soldiers going home in coffins, with 3 million people opposed to them, then they could eventually capture this building. But what purpose? What on earth would be the point in that? No other governments would recognise their puppet government. The government being in that building wouldn't make it the government of Ukraine. It's not a magical thing. It hasn't got magical powers to give them control of Ukraine. It's just a building. And Zelensky would go off to some other building in some other part of Ukraine, probably in western Ukraine, and the resistant fighters, and Ukrainian has a trained resistance. They have developed the capability to resist based on previous occupations and experience from previous occupations. And they have, like commando-style, resistant fighters, and they could converge on Kyiv, and everyone in Ukraine would follow Zelensky, resistance fighters would converge on Kyiv and attack the government, and the fighters that are friendly with Russia, they're the other side now. They're in the Donbass region, in the separatist region of Donbass, in Crimea. They're the other side of a battle line. And they would have to fight through the Ukrainian forces in order to get anywhere near Kyiv, so they are not going to help. So what would be the point? And there's none. This can't be Putin's plan. And this is why I'm saying that, and this is not based on my ideas, this is based on the Center for Defense Strategies, which was an organization set up to advise the Ukrainian government. And they have on-the-spot intelligence about Ukraine. They know Ukraine better than anyone. They have experience of the actual fighting there, and know what they can do and what Russia can do, and what they can't do and what Russia can't do. And they say it's impossible. They say there's no way that Russia will try to capture Kyiv. And I mean, these are open sources, anyone can read, but the United States 5-star general, they would know anyway what these people are saying. I do not believe that a United States 5-star general is advising Biden that Putin could do this. This makes no sense. So this must be some kind of information war. It's a war of words. It's not going to be an actual war. So now let's go into a bit more detail. First of all, a Russian installed government, it wouldn't be safe even in armoured cars. Remember that Ukraine is equipped with many anti-tank missiles and shoulder-mounted anti-tank missiles, including brand new ones from United States, but also many of their own indigenous ones that would be able to destroy even a tank. So they're not going to be safe even driving around in armoured cars in Ukraine. Now let's look at the invasion, which again, this Center for Defense Studies says that there's no way that they could do that. They say that attempts to push further into the territory of Ukraine will be met with significant resistance from our forces. So now, if you're a tourist, then that's the road to Kyiv, and it's a pleasant road with trees on both sides. But if you are a tank, so there we are, that's if you're a tourist, 3 hours and 5 minutes and you're there. But now, if you suppose you now try to drive along the Autobahn in one of these, and you have a very different experience. First of all, the opponents, they're going to be making extemporized obstacles. They're going to be turning over lorries, burning them. They're going to be piling logs on there and piling piles of rubble. They're getting lorries and even like rubbish trucks and dumpster trucks. They'd be going around and dumping their rubbish on the road, and they'd be pouring, and you get cement mixer with instant concrete, pouring it down on top of the mess. And then all that would be mixed up with barbed wire and booby traps and mines, and that's what they'd be having to try to get through. They're not going to be just driving down to Kyiv in 3 hours. And then these are special things. You see these huge big things which a tank can't drive over, and you've got these improvised expedient obstacles. There's things called abatis, which is basically you fell a tree, and there are lots of trees on either side. Of course, they can cut through them, they can burn them, but this will be added with everything else, and the wire and everything. And add mines and wire and booby traps. And then, as they drive along that road, on either side of the road, Ukraine now has thousands of these shoulder-mounted anti-tank missiles, which can destroy a modern Russian tanks from up to 2 kilometers away. They're very easy to use. They fire and forget. The fire can then run away after they've fired it. They look at the target. It's got a heat-seeking sensor on it, and then once they've fired in, they look at the image and they say, okay, it's got the instructions. Then they run out of the way, and it's very sneaky. It goes along horizontally for a while, and then it suddenly surges up, so the enemy can't see where it was shot from. It can also be shot out of windows of houses because of the way it goes horizontally first. And they also have many of their own missiles there. Do I mention that? I meant to mention it. Yes, they have their own nuclear-made anti-tank guided missiles. And they now have these Stinger shoulder-mounted ground-to-air missiles. And he's going to shoot down attack helicopters. That's significant because while the Russians were invading, then they would be, in actuality, if they were doing an invasion, they would have their tanks go along the road, but then to either side they'd have motorised divisions going through the forest, and they'd have attack helicopters trying to find all the people with their anti-tank missiles. And the way the Soviet strategy, which both Ukraine and Russia would use, is that the tanks aren't in the front. And you don't get tanks fighting tanks. The tanks are a little way back, and then you have these other formations going around. But the Ukrainians now have these Stinger shoulder-mounted ground-to-air missiles to shoot down the attack helicopters, which will make it much harder. So it means that very quickly, within a couple of days, then Russia would have the air supremacy over Ukraine. And that's the first thing they do. They'd destroy all the Russian military aircraft. But then, because of these Stinger, these ground-to-air missiles, this changes the dynamic. And again, why has Russia waited for Ukraine to get Stinger shoulder-mounted ground-to-air missiles, which they got last Sunday, and they're now being trained in them? Why did Russia wait for that if their aim was to attack Kyiv or any kind of invasion? Why have they been waiting for that? You know, you can imagine these generals saying, "Oh, we've been waiting we waited last year wasn't the right time. We went away again. I know they were very weak then. We come back again this year, and now at last they've got the Stinger ground-to-air missiles. This is our moment to attack." I mean, how does that make sense? And the answer is it doesn't. And so now a very rapid advance, and that's 20 miles a day. And there's an example here, the quickest advance of armoured forces in history. And the Germans managed 20 miles a day, and there's another advance as well in 2003. And those are two fastest advances in recorded history, took 20 miles a day. So it would take a week, that's why I say it would take a week, to get from the border to Kyiv. That is assuming that the Russians were winning this fight. But remember, the Ukrainians are very well equipped, and it's their home ground, and it's not certain that they would advance at even very fast at all. And then, in addition, to make it even worse than that, then this is a video, and this is actually from a few days last week, I think it was. These are actual Russian tanks in exercise in Belarus on friendly territory, just doing more exercises, and a dozen Russian tanks sunk in the mud. So we don't get mud like that in many places, but in Russia they have this deep quagmires, so deep that a tank, if it goes in the wrong place, it can sink right up to its turret in a deep quagmire. And in winter they can advance because it's frozen, but apparently had a warm winter, and we've got the thaw coming up, which will make it even worse. But it's already so bad that a dozen tanks were sunk in the mud. And imagine trying to excavate a dozen tanks in the middle of a war zone. So they got these excavators out, digging out the tanks. But now imagine doing it in a war zone with the enemy soldiers with their shoulder-mounted anti-tank missiles. And this is a German World War III tank. That is actually the tank that's being pulled out of this bog. Give you an idea of how deep the bogs are there. So it would take weeks it would take weeks, because once you get to Kyiv, then it's not easy fighting in a city. The examples from the Iraq War, for instance, and just Fallujah, I think was the name of the place, where a couple of months that it took, and that was very asymmetrical, with the Iraqis having far inferior weapons to the Americans, and yet the Americans couldn't capture this small city of 250,000 people. And in this case, it's much more equally balanced. The Ukrainians, The Ukrainian tanks are about equal in capability to the Russian tanks, although they have fewer of them. They have these anti-tank missiles now. Ukraine actually exports tanks to other countries, so it's got pretty good quality tanks. And so, although Russia's got more, then apparently in a modern war, having lots of tanks is not really so much of an advantage, because you don't put them on the front line, because in a modern war they are so much vulnerable to artillery fire now. So that big advantage of 1,000 tanks isn't such a big advantage at all in a modern war. And so, and then what is the advantage? Yes, so then the Ukrainian Center for Defense Studies says that 30,000 wouldn't be anything like enough to subdue a city of 3 million people. I'm not sure if they meant the 30,000 or the 130,000. I'm not sure even 130,000 would. They're saying that there would be an organized resistance. So Russia is actually, this is about the history of how in the past the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, that's in the past, and they fought back against the Germans and against the Soviet, against the occupying Poles, then against the Soviet Russians, then against the retreating Germans. They've had a long history of occupiers that they fought back against, and their descendants are still there and active, and they have summer camps every year. And they basically train commandos. They're trained insurrectionists. And then the Ukrainian government has prepared, this was already there, and then the Ukrainian government has rather cleverly kind of taken them and adapted their ethos and got them behind the government. So they are now all there ready to spring into action if the country is invaded as a resistance force within Ukraine, already prepared and ready so it's the resistance operating concept, and this is NATO's Comprehensive Defence Handbook. So this is something that are in border countries of NATO, that they have an organised resistance movement all ready to spring into action if Russia was to invade. So it's not just an ad hoc, and they have amongst the highest levels of guns in private use in Ukraine, in Europe. It's nowhere near the United States levels, but they're very high for Europe. So there are many civilians in Ukraine who know how to handle a gun as well. And then you have these trained resistance movements, which are not the part of the regular army, but they're trained to resist if there's an invasion. So on the Ukrainian side, massive morale. They're fighting for their own country. They're very concerned about invasion. They're prepared for invasion. Then on the Russian side, the Russian soldiers, then they have very low support in Russia for the necessity of war. Russian people don't want to fight Ukraine. They think of Ukraine as their brothers. And the popularity, as they say there, the popularity in that same study, the popularity of the ruling elite is periodically declining, and support for the necessity of war with Ukraine. And then the many Ukrainians in Russia, they've got 1.9 million ethnic Ukrainians, and then there are 14 million ethnic Russians in Ukraine. So the Russians in the Russian army, some of them would be Ukrainian, and then they're fighting against people, some of whom are ethnic Russians. And then we look at the propaganda. So the Russia and Belarus, if they really wanted to attack Ukraine, I mean, morale is very important in a war. Soldiers who don't believe in the cause that they're fighting for are going to lose against defenders who have very strong morale and strongly believe, and they're fighting for their own country and for their beliefs. And the Russians are not even trying to prepare the mindset that would be needed for soldiers. Indeed, they just constantly, every single time that the United States say and that NATO say that Russia plans to invade, Russia and Belarus, they just deny it. And after the 16th, remember they predicted an invasion on a specific day, the 16th of February. Nothing happened. And here's Lukashenko, president of Belarus, saying, do you still believe we'll attack Ukraine from here? You're still entertaining this crazy idea. Calm down. You must admit to the whole world community, if you have some integrity, that you have screwed up. You insisted that Russia and Belarus would invade Ukraine yesterday. That was the day after the supposed invasion. We did not. Your intelligence is worthless, although you spend billions of dollars on it. Admit at least this. So, but for some reason, the United States, and I was predicting this before, that there's no way the United States, because it's very like the false prophets that we are so often have to debunk. And then you can almost predict that after they've said that a particular date, then it's so common for these false prophets to say then, okay, I made a mistake, it's going to be the next day, and then the next day, and they keep dragging it on and on. And that seems to be what the United States is doing. It's a different reason, but it's a similar psychology. And so Russia is constantly saying, no, we are not going to invade. No, we're not going to invade. So I know they're being very provocative with these huge armies near the border, but they are not prepping up their soldiers for an invasion. Indeed, the opposite. They're constantly telling their soldiers these are just exercises, we're not going to invade. And they keep saying Russia is not going to attack anyone. And Russia, as I said, they need to feel they're fighting a just war, or they're going to lose. And then another thing to bear in mind is that Russia has never done a big invasion like this. Never since the last, it would be Russia's largest combined arms operation since the Battle of Berlin in 1945. They've never done it. They have no experience of doing something like this with modern equipment against an opponent who also has modern equipment. This is a fight of a type that's never happened. It just never happened. The equivalent of Ukraine fighting the equivalent of Russia with the equivalent of such a large army. Russia has no experience of it. Nobody has any experience of this. And apparently there's a phrase in Russian, the first pliny is always a mess, which is when you're making these Russian pancakes, then the first pancake you make apparently for some reason is a mess. So they're saying that an invasion of Ukraine, it would be its first ever operation like this, it would be bound to be a mess. And there would be, and then there's the whole point of the social media. I'm not sure where I've got on the page, but the maybe I should highlight that with another graphic. The burned out tanks. Yes, I can do a graphic of burned out tank or something. The social media would be sharing photographs of burned out Russian tanks, and there would be and the Russian soldiers, they would be dying and going back in coffins, and all this and the defeats of Russia would be on social media. And Russia is not like North Korea. North Korea is the only country that can cut off its border to the internet, because North Korea actually has an intranet. It's basically a private network over the entire country. It's got different IP addresses. It just can't connect, and it's not even, I'm not sure it's even physically connected to the internet. So North Korea can do that. No other country in the world is cut off like that. So the on social media, and Ukraine, those 1.9 million Ukrainians, their friends in Ukraine, they'll be sending them photographs and videos of all the defeats of all the Russian tanks being destroyed. And the Russia are just not ready for that. This would be very unpopular in Russia, and it would likely lead, if they ever did such a thing, it would likely lead to unrest in Russia. It would lead to attacks, and it would lead to, it might even, indeed, it pretty certainly would be the end of Putin's regime, if this really happened. And then what is the point? What are they trying to achieve there? So Russia, the Ukrainian national debt is $80 billion, which is nothing compared with the United States national debt. But for Russia, that is a huge amount to add to its own current debt, which isn't that much more. What is Russia's current debt is 282 billion US dollars. So they would be adding significantly to the Russian debt. From 282, add another $80 billion to it. But then that's not all, because you've got all the expense of the war itself that Russia would have to fund, and then you have the expense of that Ukraine is spending out of its money to fight its side of the war, and then once the war is over, you then have to rebuild the Ukrainian economy. It's already being damaged just by the threats, the claims that there's going to be a war. The Ukrainian economy, it's a developing country. Ukraine is not highly developed. It's got a weak economy. It is struggling it is struggling already. So the end result of this war, and it doesn't have any significant natural resources to pay for the war. So the end of this will be Ukraine, Russia, and it wouldn't capture all of Ukraine, and there would be resistance fighters there all the way through. Even for decades in the future, the Ukrainians have this history of fighting back against invaders. They would still be fighting back by 2030, 2040. They'd still be, if they kept it that long, through to 2050, there would still be Ukrainian resistance fighters fighting back against the Russians. So they'd have to pay for that too, and for the recovery of the Ukrainian economy. They'd have many Russians continuing to die. It just does not make sense as an objective. It makes absolutely no sense. Now, all this is not my ideas. This is based on military analysis that I don't know anything about these things. I'm just summarizing the very best sources that I can find. And in my book, then the Ukrainian government advisory is the best of all the ones I've found. And then I'm using some other also very good sources here. And this, so a big invasion makes no sense, but even a small one has again the same, this is another source. There's a Navy, United Kingdom Navy officer who gives an analysis, who knows a bit about it. So I used him as well. And then there's a foundation, another foundation I use. There's several sources I use here. Anyway, so look at this again, that if Putin annexed the so this is something that Putin could do. Putin could annex the separatist regions there in eastern Ukraine. That is something they could do. But why, again? Because this is Putin's ace in his hand. So Russia is already pretty much in control of this area already. There isn't any Ukrainian government presence there, just Russian government presence. Many of them have Russian passports too, and that's the line of the fight. And Russia wants, so Russia could very easily just make that part of Russia. But they don't want to do that. Russia's ploy all along has been to say to Ukraine, you've got to make this an autonomous part of Ukraine. And that's basically the ace in Putin's hand. Because if the Ukrainian government has to put in something in its constitution about giving the Donbass, the autonomous, this is just part of the Donbass region, not all of it is separatist controlled. If they gave that, they had to write something about that into the Ukrainian constitution. It's like a Trojan horse that could prevent Ukraine from ever joining NATO, because these people would veto it. So that is what Putin is trying to get Ukraine to do. And Ukraine is resisting that. So if Putin was to go in and capture this region, then he's no longer got any reason. He's no longer any reason to say to start with, the Minsk Accords would be completely gone. By doing that, he's ended the Minsk Accords. And he's lost any possibility of any leverage with the Ukrainian government of using this to try and modify the Ukrainian constitution. So there's absolutely no way that Russia actually intends to capture, to take over this, which they already have control of over anyway. De facto they're in control. There's no way they're going to invade or try and get the rest of Donbass region. That makes no sense. And then in the answer to Biden, then Putin said that if the negotiations if they don't get their way in negotiations, if Biden doesn't promise to take NATO forces back away from the NATO countries like Latvia and Estonia, it's a very big ask that Putin is making, which he must know is impossible. And then at the end of that he says, and if you don't do that, we will consider military technical measures. So what are those? It does not mean a military invasion. According to Dr. Greg Austin, it means something like an enforced embargo to prevent Ukraine getting new weapons from NATO. But Ukraine already has those weapons now. It's a year too late. To stop Ukraine, because they've already got those, like I've said, Russia's already waited until Ukraine got the Stinger ground-to-air missiles, which deals with an awful lot of the main advantage that Russia would have if it was to try to invade Ukraine. It's already lost a lot of its really big advantage of attack helicopters. So the military technical measures, these are measures that Russia could do to prevent NATO supplying weapons to Ukraine, like for instance preventing them flying into Ukrainian airports. They could, very extreme, but one of these measures they could do is they could take over airports in Ukraine that they claim are being used for bringing in weapons. But they haven't done that. And the time to do that would have been last year, not this year. So this is an empty threat they're making, and to blockade the Black Sea, again to prevent Turkey or NATO supplying weapons to Ukraine. That's already happened. Since last year, Turkey has supplied their Neptune drone to Ukraine, which is a drone that is capable of hitting targets 300 kilometers away. So Ukraine can now attack Russian targets from a distance of 300 kilometers using a very capable drone from Turkey. And they didn't stop that. So these whole military technical measures is an empty threat. They've already let the weapons in. So there's no way that this is any kind of military strategy. And now, first of all, one thing, a lot of people worry that this is all going to be a nuclear war. And so Ukraine has no nuclear weapons. It has some nuclear power stations, but there's no way that Russia is going to attack the Ukrainian nuclear power stations. That would just make things worse, because they want Ukraine to be on as friendly terms as possible and to attack their power stations. And of course, in case you don't, again, if by accident Russia was to attack a Ukrainian power station and you got a radioactive release, you don't get a nuclear bomb explosion, you just get radioactive leak, like has already happened with Chernobyl, and it only contaminates the local area, and people have a hugely exaggerated idea of what a nuclear power station is. So it'd be a very big, difficult cleanup operation, but only a local thing. And but there's no. So the only thing at risk in Ukraine are the nuclear power stations. Russia is not going to try to target those. It's going to be very careful not to hit those. And Russia, and in return for the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, Ukraine gave all its nukes back to Russia. It has no nukes. Ukraine is not part of NATO, so this means that there's no mutual defense pact, but United States, United Kingdom and Russia did agree to support Ukraine, and Russia, of course, if it attacked, would be a big violation. There's not even the slightest grey area legal justification for this. So that's why nobody would recognise their government, their public government, even if they did succeed. So if they have grey area justification in Crimea, they say that Crimea has voted that they want to become part of Russia, and that their agreement in 1994 did not extend to saying they have to keep Crimea in Ukraine if they want to leave. They don't have anything, not even the slightest excuse for attacking Kyiv or attacking any of the other parts of Ukraine. And so the United States and the United Kingdom, they have very good reason to supply defensive weapons to Ukraine, and that's the basis for which they're doing that. But they don't have a defence pact, so they will not be involved in fighting back Russia, just supplying weapons and intelligence. If there was an attack, which, as you can see, it doesn't make sense, they will attack. And then, if you worry about the Icbm tests, these are just routine tests firing at Russia, and they actually fired from a sub in the Pacific, another firing from somewhere in the northern oceans, and then some things on land. They're firing at their own country. And Russia does those every year. And this actually did a test on Icbm in June 2021. They did one test then. This is just a somewhat larger test than the one they did last June. And so, as I said here, we don't know what the nobody knows what Putin wants, and so we need to talk, and we need dialogue, and this dialogue is going on. And so, why does US keep saying that Putin will invade? And I say perhaps perhaps it's to help ensure that Russia keeps saying it won't invade. And anyway, the whole negotiating strategy is like on both sides they've got a war of words. Their whole negotiating strategy for Russia is the threat, because it's got a very weak hand apart from this, and so it's just having it needs to seem like a real threat. So Russia is constantly making sure that these soldiers on its border seem like a real threat. But it's just a war of words. There's no way that they actually do intend to use them. And so they're just doing these exercises. They're saying these are defensive exercises. They've got all this excuse as to why they have such large numbers on the border, and then they're just it's kind of letting the West panic and hoping to get some advantage from that. And I say it's like when two stags fight, and this is William Else in the group, and the way he put it, I thought he put it very well. It's like when two stags fight, a lot of noise and fury signifying nothing, just redefining the boundaries. But the sad thing is that the effect this has on mental health impact. And just want to make absolutely clear, the only reason I'm doing all this is to help scared people. I am not trying in any way to have any political influence on either Russia or United States or NATO or the Separatists or Ukrainians, or to say who's right and who's wrong. It's just to help scared people. And so the strategists, whatever their reason they're doing, I'm saying, do consider the mental health impact of what you're doing, and also indirectly through the economic effect on Ukraine and the mental health effect of that on all the people in Ukraine. And this is all amplified by journalists. So for journalists, this is their biggest story. It's get people glued to the TV and the internet. So if they go and look at their metrics, they say, how many people have watched the BBC News tonight? Or they go and look how many people have read the BBC News website tonight. And they'll be getting huge, huge numbers. And so they're saying, we're doing things right, we've got to do more of that. And the reason is because, some of the people that I help, they're checking the news all day. Constantly checking the news. They post to the group several times an hour, scared. They send me PMs constantly. And then they wake up in the middle of the night to check the news again. And they're afraid that World War III is going to happen. So in terms of the media, this is a huge success for the media, that they're getting huge, huge, huge viewing figures and huge reading figures. They must do for the people I'm helping. But they should please consider the mental health impact of running these stories in this dramatic way. It's maybe the biggest stories of the year so far, and you're getting a huge, huge viewing, but is it ethical? Is the way you're getting these views, is it ethical? Do consider the ethics of what you're doing. Do you realize what you're doing to people's mental health? And then the same also for the politicians. So Putin, he's getting massive amount of attention. He's getting the leaders around the world coming to talk to him because of his soldiers marching up and down. Is he considering the mental health impact, and including on Russians, Ukrainians, but also on Russians? He's getting scared too. And then the United States and Biden, is he considering the mental health? So I know Biden, he's very caring about the. He's very much wants to have the medicine available and good healthcare available to the weaker people and the elderly, and he wants them to have the funding for especially people with disadvantage and the people who are poor. So he does care about people. He has this warm heart. So is Biden, do consider what is this doing to the mental health impact of the people in the United States. A lot of people that I help are in the United States. So Biden, you care for these people. You run a platform helping them. You run on a platform helping with mental health and helping with physical and mental health. So what is this doing to the mental health of the people that you are standing for? I don't think he's thinking about this. I don't think this is in his mind. I'm sure he doesn't intend to make people suicidal. But that's what he's doing. So this is my strong, strong message, to these world leaders and to the journalists. Please, please, please consider the mental health impact of what you're doing. How many people have even committed suicide as a result of all this? I know that several have contemplated it. And then for people who have got caught up in all this, first of all, I hope this debunk has helped you to disengage a bit and help you to realize, so this is the logical debunk. Now, you need to give space in your mind for other things. Try and see if you can let go of the media circus. Like, it's fascinating, maybe. It's getting your mind caught up. It's like you go and visit a circus, you see people doing all sorts of dramatic things. You can't take your eye off the stage. But, it's good to find something. So it's a little bit hard to key down from something like this. So you've got your adrenaline going. Try and see if you can find relaxing, peaceful things to do. And they will seem kind of boring and a little bit difficult to do to start with. You do something you normally enjoy, like maybe painting, maybe playing music, maybe talking to friends in a relaxed way, joking and laughing, not about the war. And a bit of a walk, or making things, doing things. So try to find something to do that is relaxing and enjoyable, that is not to do with Ukraine. The idea is going to be rushing through your mind all the time about Ukraine, but don't try to do something else. Just let those thoughts do their rushing around. And so you can't forcefully stop yourself from thinking about Ukraine. So I give the example of, can you stop yourself from thinking about the yellow hippo? So for 30 seconds, don't think about yellow hippo with a pink hat. Don't think about yellow hippo with a pink hat. Try and stop for 30 seconds, 20 seconds. And I can't help but think about thousands of yellow hippos with pink hats. So that is, maybe it's a remark of people that can do it, but most people can't stop a thought like that. So if you think about it, then trying to stop yourself from thinking about Ukraine, that doesn't work. So instead, you've got to be a little bit more gentle with your mind, and instead try and just try and find something else to do in your day that you enjoy, that you relax, and you think, and you present it as choices. I could spend the next hour searching online to see what's the latest about the Ukraine and watching all the videos and listening to the news. I could listen to the news 6 times, or I could do, I could, I don't know, do some gardening, say. I could plant some plants, or I could draw something. And even if you are not good at drawing, you can still use drawing as a relaxation. Try and draw something physical. Try and can you do a cartwheel, say, or something you wanted to do? Then just doesn't matter if you succeed. Then just or you're playing a game with someone, anything. There are lots of things you can do. And then the various, I've put some links to resources here to help scared people. So the World Health Organization, doing what matters at times of stress, by breathing in and out and slowly and deeply, another way to calm a panic attack. That has a lot of resources at the end that you can link to that help with mental health. So I do, and you may well, if you, there's no shame involved if you need help from a therapist. So many people need this from time to time, and it's just like you need help sometimes if you break your leg, then or you break your arm. You wouldn't say, "Oh well, I've just got to soldier on because I've broken my arm," but I'm tough and I don't need a splint and I don't need to do anything. And you end up with a kind of wiggly arm that doesn't work properly. So it's the same with mental health areas. Then there comes a point where there is professional help and there's many things they can do to help people who have got anxiety disorders. And it would be not at all surprising if you're developing an anxiety disorder as a result of what's happening with the Ukraine and all this news. It is possible to develop anxiety disorders and even post-traumatic stress disorder, not from anything physical happening in your life, but just from the news. I've helped people that they've been diagnosed as having things like PTSD because of just from things they've read. Things like the climate change or you use things or fake stories and so on. So if you may need professional help if you got really anxious about this. So do bear that in mind. And meanwhile, there's lots of resources here that I link to some that I've got lots of links to resources in these links here that hopefully will help some of you that have got very scared. And we have our group, Doom City Debunk group, and especially if you're a debunker, if you are good at fact checking, if you're knowledgeable about these topics, and also if you are good at helping people who are very scared. And also a lot of our members are autistic, and a lot of others have bipolar disorder. Others are neither of those. The three main people that tend to get most affected, people who are very imaginative, who don't have any mental disorder, they're just very imaginative. We have people who are bipolar. They in their manic phase, and they find it very difficult to cope with things like this. And then people who are very autistic. This is just anecdotal, not on a survey, but we have a very high number of people who are autistic. The autistic people take things very literally. They often they don't have very much gap when they see a scary story. They don't have much gap, or to use previous experience. They're much more direct in the way they respond to things. And then they often are very they take things very seriously and very literally. Not everyone, it's a spectrum, but they tend to be it's lots of different things in one term, but they tend to be very vulnerable to scary stories, and we have a lot of autistic people. So if you are used to working with autistic people as well, then you can help some of the scared people in our group as well, and just by knowing where they're coming from. So you're very welcome to help in the group if you are able to help some of the scared people, or if you're scared. Our Doom City Debunk group on Facebook. And okay, I think those are main things I've said. Oh yes, and then just these are my other debunks. I've got a whole load of debunks about Ukraine, and so if you need more, then these are. And the first one is a whole list of graphics and videos, and they like these graphics that I did. All these graphics here. There's a whole list of them down there. So and this is about why so few in the Western media challenge this narrative of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it's not a priority for journalists to fact check the scared people, and it's not. So I talked there a bit about why I'm coming at this in a different direction, and all along my only priority is to help the scared people, and that gives a different point on it. And I don't actually know anyone else who is fact checking with this priority, apart from the people in our group. We are dedicated to fact checking for these scared people, and that is our complete focus. We have people from the entire range. We have some people from Russia. We have people from who are sympathetic with the separatists. So we are not there as a political group. We are there to help the scared people. We're not there to promote NATO against the separatists.